The email came at 6:42 a.m. on a Tuesday, short, sterile, and perfectly corporate. Effective immediately, your position has been terminated. We thank you for your service and wish you the best in your future endeavors. It took me a full minute to process it. Just 3 days earlier, I had stood on stage at the Investor Summit, presenting the deal that would define the company's next decade, an $850 million acquisition that doubled our international market share. The CEO himself had shaken my hand, the CFO toasted my name, and the COO told me, "You just secured your place in this company's history." Apparently, history had a short memory. I sat there in my home office, staring at that message, my coffee going cold beside the laptop. No explanation. No call. Just a form email sent by HR on behalf of a man too cowardly to face me. I had given 19 years to that company, longer than the CEO had been out of college. I'd worked through weekends, missed family milestones, even defended them when journalists accused our leadership of shady ethics. And now, after winning them their biggest deal ever, they threw me away like a broken pen. I should have felt anger, but what I felt instead was focus, a quiet, steady hum of clarity. Because they had forgotten something very important, I was the one who wrote the contracts. The $850 million deal wasn't just a merger. It was a labyrinth of conditions, contingencies, and legal tripwires, all drafted under my supervision. For years, I had been the company's contract whisperer, the guy who could write clauses so tight that no rival firm could wriggle through. I knew the law better than anyone in that building. And 2 years ago, after watching management repeatedly exploit employees under vague agreements, I decided to create something of my own. Not for revenge, at least not then. For protection. A clause so subtle, so deeply buried, that only someone who understood both contract law and corporate psychology could even notice it. I called it the mutual dependency provision. The clause stated that if the company terminated the lead negotiator or deal author within 30 days of a signed acquisition, without stated cause, the entire contract would automatically enter review arbitration. That meant all legal obligations were frozen, all payments withheld, and the purchasing entity had the right to withdraw without penalty. In simpler terms, if they fired me, they froze themselves. And that's exactly what happened. 2 days after my termination, I received a panicked message from an old friend in finance. "We've got a problem. The acquisition money isn't transferring. Legal's losing it." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I knew what came next. The partner company's lawyers would notice the clause, trigger arbitration, and suddenly every executive in my old company would be scrambling to explain why they'd fired the man whose signature made the deal valid. Within a week, the merger was dead. The stock dropped 40%. Investors started demanding answers. And by the time the board realized the depth of their mistake, their COO had resigned to pursue other opportunities. It was beautiful, in a cold, mathematical way. Not because I wanted chaos, but because I wanted balance. They built their empire on paper and arrogance, forgetting that the paper had been written by human hands. Hands that remembered every betrayal. Every broken promise. Every time they said, "You're lucky to have this job." 3 weeks later, I was invited, anonymously, to a private arbitration session. Their lawyers were desperate, their voices cracked with panic. They asked if I'd be willing to consult on fixing the problem I had inadvertently created. I smiled and said I'd think about it. But I didn't. They wanted me back only to clean their mess, not because they valued what I built. Instead, I reached out to the company that had been on the other side of the merger, their former partner. I explained what had happened, cleanly, professionally. They weren't angry at me. In fact, they offered me a consulting contract to ensure their future deals were protected from executive negligence. The irony wasn't lost on me. I took the job. at double the pay. Months passed, and the ripples kept spreading. News outlets started covering the collapse as a cautionary tale of corporate greed and contractual oversight. The CEO blamed the legal team. The legal team blamed HR. HR blamed an unauthorized clause. They never said my name, but I knew I was the ghost haunting every boardroom slide deck and every nervous shareholder call. And I didn't gloat. I didn't send taunting emails or seek recognition. My revenge wasn't about humiliation, it was about equilibrium. I wanted them to feel the weight of their own carelessness, to realize that every number on a spreadsheet represents a person who can choose, one day, to stop carrying their burden. Now, when I wake up in the morning, there's no anxiety, no dread. Just coffee, a view of the city skyline, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that I took nothing from them they hadn't already given away through their own arrogance. The world didn't end when they fired me. It simply adjusted, and I was no longer on the losing side of balance. And if any of them ever read this, I'd say just one thing: next time you fire someone, read your own contracts first. The aftermath was a corporate slow-motion implosion. For months, headlines cycled through words like unexpected setback, executive shakeup, and unexplained $1.7 billion loss. Behind those phrases was the truth: one clause, one man they underestimated, and one act of poetic precision. The deal that was supposed to be their crowning achievement became their undoing. The irony still makes me smile sometimes. They wanted me gone before the press release went live, thinking they could take the credit and leave me out of the spotlight. Instead, they took the fall alone, live on air, while I watched from my living room, sipping coffee and enjoying the quiet. Their new COO tried to fix it, of course. He called for emergency reviews, demanded renegotiations, even flew across the country to meet with the acquisition board. But it was too late. The arbitration clause was airtight, my clause, and once triggered, it couldn't be undone without both parties' consent. The partner company wasn't stupid. They saw the chaos, the desperation, and they walked away. Within weeks, the $850 million win had transformed into a $1.7 billion collapse. Stocks tanked, the board convened an emergency session, and within 48 hours, the CEO who had fired me was retiring to spend more time with family. The COO followed him out the door shortly after, carrying the weight of my signature like a curse he couldn't lift. I didn't celebrate. I didn't throw a party or make a victory speech. I just sat there, letting the silence speak for itself. Because this wasn't about revenge in the Hollywood sense, there was no shouting, no destruction, no final confrontation in a glass office. It was about precision, patience, and principle. They fired me thinking I was obsolete, a relic of another era. But the truth is, I wasn't outdated, I was foundational. They just didn't realize how much of the company's DNA had been written in my language. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a corporate ethics symposium. Ironic, I know, about the hidden value of integrity in contract law. I accepted. When I stepped onto the stage, the crowd fell silent, their faces curious, skeptical. I started with a story. Not about betrayal, but about foresight. When you write contracts, I told them, you're not just defining obligations, you're defining trust. The words on those pages are only as strong as the respect between the people signing them. Remove that respect, and the words turn to knives. Afterward, a few executives approached me. Some looked nervous, others genuinely inspired. One of them, a young woman who couldn't have been older than 30, said quietly, "My company just went through something like that. They cut our entire legal team for efficiency. It's been chaos ever since." I gave her a sympathetic nod and said, "Then maybe you should remind them that efficiency doesn't build safety, people do." She smiled like she'd been waiting for someone to say that out loud. Back home, life was calmer. I consulted for companies that actually listen, trained young lawyers to protect their work, and made sure no one else got blindsided by the kind of betrayal I'd faced. Every time I looked at the city lights outside my window, I felt a strange peace. I hadn't just taken revenge, I had rewritten my own ending. One afternoon, as I was leaving a client meeting, I bumped into an old colleague from my former company. He looked worn down, eyes sunken, voice low. "You know," he said, "they still talk about you in there. Some of them say what you did was genius. Others call it sabotage." I smiled faintly and said, "They can call it whatever they like. I just followed the rules, the ones they agreed to." He nodded, half in admiration, half in disbelief. "You really got the last word, didn't you?" he said. I shook my head. "No," I replied. "I just wrote the last clause." And with that, I walked away, not bitter, not gloating, but calm. Because true revenge isn't loud or angry. It's silent. It's clean. It's watching the system that thought it owned you crumble under the weight of your absence, and knowing, without a doubt, that justice doesn't always need a witness, only a signature. Months turned into a year, and I almost forgot how much noise that company used to make, the endless meetings, the artificial urgency, the constant race to impress the board. I didn't miss any of it. My days were quiet now. I worked on my own terms, consulting only for firms that valued ethics over shortcuts. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who was once labeled a bureaucratic relic had become the person modern corporations hired to prevent the very downfall my old company suffered. Every once in a while, my phone would buzz with a headline, "Former COO of Vertex Dynamics indicted for misrepresentation in contract deal," or "Investigations reveal irregularities in board decisions following $1.7 billion collapse." I didn't need to read the details. I already knew how it all unfolded. The cracks I'd warned them about had widened into chasms, swallowing what was left of their empire. What they never understood was that success built on arrogance is a ticking clock. You can ignore it for a while, but eventually, it rings loud enough for everyone to hear. One evening, as I was finishing a late dinner, I received a message from an unknown number. It was a photo, the company's old headquarters, dark, the once bright sign stripped from the glass facade. Beneath it, a simple text, "Guess you were right." No name. No need for one. The message said enough. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen for a long time, then deleted it. Closure, I realized, isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about silence, the kind that follows a storm once it's done proving its point. A few months later, the board quietly sold off what remained of the company's assets. No press conference, no statement, just a notice buried in a legal database. The building was repurposed into a co-working hub for small startups. Every floor that once echoed with cold ambition now hummed with fresh energy and new beginnings. When I drove past it one morning, the sight almost made me laugh. There it was, the monument to corporate greed, reborn as a space for dreamers and builders. I rolled down the window, let the cool air in, and smiled. Justice, I thought, doesn't always wear a robe. Sometimes it wears time. And yet, the best part wasn't the downfall, it was what came after. The peace. The clarity. The understanding that revenge, if done right, isn't about destruction at all. It's about restoring balance. About giving truth the space it needs to breathe. They took from me something they thought I couldn't get back, dignity, purpose, identity. But all they really did was set me free. Free from a system that had long stopped respecting the people who built it. A journalist once asked me during an interview, "If you could go back, would you do it again?" I didn't hesitate. "No," I said. "I'd do it smarter." He laughed, thinking I was joking. But I wasn't. Because life isn't about revenge, it's about precision. About making every decision count so that when you walk away, you do it with your head high and your conscience clear. I still keep a framed copy of that original contract on my office wall. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every clause, every word, every line, it all tells a story. A story of loyalty misplaced, arrogance exposed, and justice written in ink instead of blood. Sometimes, I glance at it before starting a new project, and I think about the CEO who called me redundant. If only he'd read the fine print. There was something poetic about how the world had moved on while they were still trapped in the wreckage they created. I built something small but strong, surrounded by people who believed in doing things right. No endless politics, no self-serving hierarchies, just good work and good people. Sometimes, when a young associate asked me why I left my last firm, I'd smile faintly and say, "They fired me for winning." That usually earned a puzzled look, but I never explained further. Some stories are best told in silence. One rainy afternoon, I was reviewing contracts for a client when my assistant told me there was someone waiting in the lobby. It was the daughter of the former CEO, the same man who had humiliated me in front of the boardroom years ago. She looked different now, older, humbled. She sat across from me, clutching a folder, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think my father wanted me to give you this." Inside was a handwritten letter, an apology. It was raw, desperate, filled with words that took him years too long to say. He wrote about regret, about ambition, about realizing too late that the company's success had been built on people he never truly valued. I read it once, folded it neatly, and handed it back. "Tell him I appreciate it," I said. "But I already forgave him the day he fired me." She nodded slowly, tears forming in her eyes, and for the first time in years, I felt something like closure. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Just peace, that quiet, weightless kind that comes when a chapter finally ends on its own terms. After she left, I looked out the window at the rain streaking down the glass and thought about all the years I'd spent chasing approval from people who only cared about power. It felt good to know that I didn't need their validation anymore. I had written my own definition of success. That night, I went through some old boxes, full of mementos from my corporate days, awards, business cards, even the gold pen the CEO had given me for my 10th anniversary with the company. I held it for a moment, then set it down and smiled. That pen had once been a symbol of loyalty. Now, it was just a reminder that everything ends, titles, offices, even empires. What lasts are the choices we make when no one's watching. In the end, my revenge wasn't the $1.7 billion loss they suffered. It wasn't the resignations, the lawsuits, or the headlines. It was the fact that I walked away free, unbroken, unbitter, untethered. They fired me to erase me, but instead, they immortalized me in their own downfall. Every lecture, every article, every business case study that mentions the heart clause, that's me. The man they thought was obsolete. The man who quietly proved that integrity is the sharpest weapon of all. And maybe that's the real lesson: power built on arrogance is temporary, but the work of someone who believes in what they do, that echoes. It outlasts the walls, the names, the companies. When I close my office at night, the city hums below, full of people chasing their own definitions of success. I can't help but think some of them will learn the hard way, just like my old CEO did. But others, maybe, will remember my story and build something different. Something that lasts. Something honest. And if that happens, then it was all worth it. Because sometimes, the most powerful revenge isn't destruction, it's legacy. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to speak at a corporate leadership summit in New York, an event packed with the kind of executives who once would have dismissed me without a second thought. The theme was resilience and leadership, which made me laugh out loud. Resilience, I thought, wasn't something you found in boardrooms or slogans. It was something forged in silence, in humiliation, in the quiet moments after someone tells you that your best years are behind you. Still, I accepted. Standing on that stage in front of hundreds of CEOs, analysts, and investors, I could see in their faces the same mix of pride and insecurity I'd seen all those years ago. When I began to speak, the room fell still. I didn't tell them about the revenge, or the clause, or the $1.7 billion. Instead, I told them about respect, how it's not just a moral choice but a financial one. You can't build empires on fear, I said. Because fear doesn't scale. Trust does. And once it's gone, you'll never buy it back, not for any price. There was silence after I finished. Then a standing ovation, long, genuine, not the polite kind people give to fill time. Afterward, a few executives approached me, shaking my hand, asking questions about ethics and leadership. And in that moment, I realized something profound. My revenge had evolved into something else entirely. It wasn't about what I'd taken from them anymore, it was about what I'd become because of it. They had tried to erase me from the world I helped build. Instead, I became the quiet voice that haunted it, not with bitterness, but with truth. Later that evening, I walked alone through the city streets, my speech still echoing in my head. I passed a bookstore window and froze when I saw a familiar name on a hardcover spine, a business biography about corporate collapses of the decade. One of the chapters bore my old company's name. I stepped inside, flipped through it, and there it was, my clause, my contract, my quiet rebellion, written into history. I smiled faintly, closed the book, and placed it back on the shelf. It felt poetic. The man they fired for being non-essential had become the footnote to their downfall. When I got home, I found an email waiting for me. It was from the young woman who had told me months earlier about her company cutting its legal team for efficiency. She wrote, "I showed your talk to our board. They reinstated the entire department. Thank you for reminding them what matters." I sat there reading that line over and over, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something stronger than satisfaction, purpose. You see, revenge burns fast, but purpose endures. Revenge ends when the dust settles, purpose begins when you realize what the fire revealed. I never set out to destroy them, only to remind them that integrity has consequences. But in doing so, I found something far greater, clarity. The world didn't end when they fired me. It began. Sometimes, I still wake early, make coffee, and sit by the window of my quiet home office, the same kind of office I once dreamed of having, though not in the way I imagined. My phone buzzes with new messages, new opportunities, but I take my time now. I've learned that the best deals aren't written in ink, they're written in how you treat people. That's the real contract. And every time the morning light cuts through the blinds, I think back to that day, the day they fired me. The day they thought they'd won. The day they unknowingly signed their own downfall. And I smile, not with spite, but with peace. Because in the end, it wasn't vengeance that defined me. It was patience. It was precision. It was justice, written in my own hand, sealed by time, and delivered with silence. There's a certain kind of satisfaction that doesn't come from applause or revenge. It comes from knowing the truth stood quietly beside you, waiting for everyone else to catch up. In the years since everything unraveled, I've watched the world shift. The next generation of professionals is smarter, bolder, and far less forgiving of corruption. Every talk I give, every mentoring session, every conversation with a young lawyer or engineer, it's all about reminding them of one thing: never let anyone convince you that integrity is outdated. Sometimes, when people recognize my name now, it's not because of the scandal, it's because of the message that followed. Universities invite me to speak about ethics in modern corporations. Journalists write about the heart clause as a case study in the cost of arrogance. But beyond the attention, what means the most to me are the quiet notes I receive, emails from people who've been pushed out, betrayed, or overlooked. They write things like, "Your story reminded me that I wasn't crazy for wanting to do things right." Those words mean more to me than any paycheck I ever earned. I don't live in the city anymore. I moved out to the coast, a small house overlooking the water, far from the noise of boardrooms and quarterly reports. My office now is a single desk by a wide window, a few plants, and a collection of legal texts I still study from time to time, just to keep my mind sharp. There's something about the sound of the waves, steady and unbothered, that feels right. The ocean doesn't argue or demand, it just endures. Maybe that's why I've come to see my story not as one of revenge, but endurance. Every so often, I'll get a call from someone still working in that world I left behind. Sometimes they ask for advice, sometimes for insight, and occasionally, just to confess they're tired of it all. I tell them what I've learned the hard way, that walking away isn't losing. It's the quietest kind of victory. You don't have to burn down the building, sometimes, just taking your light with you is enough. And yet, despite the peace, there's one moment that always lingers in my mind, the final board meeting before it all collapsed. The COO's face, pale and stunned, as he realized what the clause meant. The look of betrayal when he understood it wasn't vengeance, just consequence. I remember the silence that followed, the kind that hums louder than any explosion. That silence was my justice. Now, when I sit by that same silence, years later, I think about what it really meant. It wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about reclaiming myself. The man they fired no longer exists. What's left is someone lighter, quieter, and far more dangerous in the way truth always is. The company never recovered. New names, new logos, new ventures tried to emerge from the wreckage, but the story followed them everywhere. Investors don't forget billion-dollar collapses tied to greed and carelessness. The CEO faded into anonymity, and the COO, well, rumor has it he's consulting for startups now, teaching risk management. I can't help but chuckle at that. If you asked me today whether I regret it, I'd say no. But it's not because they got what they deserved. It's because I got what I didn't know I needed, freedom. Real, unshakable freedom. The kind that comes from no longer needing to prove your worth to anyone but yourself. So, yes, they fired me after my $850 million win. But what they didn't understand is that I'd already built my safety into their own foundation. When they tried to cut me out, they carved out their own lifeline instead. And when the dust settled, I didn't need their empire anymore. I had built something better. My name isn't on the door of a Fortune 500 company. It's etched quietly into the stories of people who refuse to be silent. That's my legacy. That's my justice. And as the sun sets over the water, I realize it's more than enough. Years later, when I look back on everything, the firing, the silence, the collapse, it feels almost like watching someone else's story unfold. The anger that once burned in me has long cooled into something steadier, understanding. Time has a way of sanding down even the sharpest edges, and what's left isn't bitterness, it's perspective. I see now that what happened wasn't just corporate cruelty. It was the inevitable result of a culture that mistook confidence for competence, loyalty for weakness, and experience for obsolescence. But the funny thing about being underestimated is that it gives you freedom. When they pushed me out, they thought they'd erased me. What they really did was give me space to rebuild on my own terms. And that's exactly what I did. The consultancy I started quietly after leaving has become something of a hidden powerhouse. We don't take out ads or chase awards, we work by reputation alone. Every client we help rebuild after betrayal, every young professional we teach to protect their value, it all feels like another step toward balance. I don't talk about the clause much anymore. The world already knows that story, and honestly, I don't need to repeat it. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about the moment it activated, the calm inevitability of it. It wasn't rage or vengeance that drove me, it was precision. They'd signed every document, approved every term, convinced they were untouchable. That's the irony of arrogance, it blinds you to your own vulnerability. And when the collapse came, I didn't cheer. I just sat quietly, knowing that justice doesn't always need noise. A few months ago, I was invited to guest lecture at a law school. One of the students asked me, "Do you think revenge ever really solves anything?" I paused for a long moment before answering. "No," I said finally. "But accountability does. And sometimes, they look the same from the outside." The room went silent. I could see the understanding in their eyes, young, idealistic, but sharp enough to know how rare accountability really is in the world they're about to enter. When I left the lecture hall, I walked across the campus, the air cold and clear, students laughing in the distance. I realized that this, teaching, guiding, sharing the truth, had become my real victory. Not the collapse of a company or the resignation of a COO, but the quiet ripple effect of knowledge. My story had become a warning, a lesson, a reminder of how power can implode when it forgets the people who built it. Back home, I poured myself a drink and stood by the window overlooking the city. The skyline glittered, full of glass towers where new deals were being signed, new promises being made. I wondered how many of those boardrooms were built on trust, and how many on ego. Probably the same ratio as always. But now and then, one of those executives calls me, wanting to learn how to build safer. That's when I know the lesson stuck. Every empire eventually forgets the hands that raised it. But every time one falls, someone like me is there to remind them, systems don't fail because of luck, they fail because of arrogance. And the people they discard along the way? Sometimes we're not casualties. Sometimes we're the correction. So, no, I don't lose sleep over what happened. If anything, I'm grateful. They gave me the push I didn't know I needed. They made me sharper, calmer, wiser. They taught me that justice doesn't have to roar, it can whisper. And when it does, it's unstoppable. Now, when I wake up each morning and look at the horizon, I feel no resentment. Just quiet certainty. Because in the end, they fired me after my greatest victory. But that was their mistake. My true victory was realizing I didn't need them to win.